the talks are recorded and they are put up, not, you know, shortly after, like within a month, let's say, because we're all volunteers here and busy people, but they are put up on the YouTube channel, which is CRS Media. And you can access that link through the Clare Root Society website as well. So without further ado, Colm, I'm going to hand it over to you, and off you go. And thanks very much, everyone.
Oh, then, sorry. Let's get this going. Oh, have you got it on your screens? Slide there?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. So, listen, thanks all so much for coming along this evening to this. It's obviously going to be the story of the O'Brien family of Dromoland. That's more or less 1,000 years of history, and I'll be touching on various aspects of Irish and English history as well. So, you know, two for the price of one. So it's about this building here that a lot of you be familiar with, and particularly about the family who lived there, the O'Briens, who are kind of fascinating people in many ways. There's been so many of them. I mean, in many generations, they had as many as 17 children. So there's a heck of a lot of O'Briens, and there's all types of fellas, good and bad, within them, and every kind of individual. Also about the O'Briens, I think it's important that they really were an influential family throughout Irish history, and sometimes they were hugely involved, but always they were at least tangentially involved in every twist and turn of Irish history. And in fairness, they're a very photogenic family. These are girls I really like. They're this is around 1895, and their names are Clare, Eileen, Moira, and Maud. So the first thing about the O'Briens, which people sometimes perhaps misunderstand, is they're Irish, absolutely Irish, perhaps more Irish than many of us, because they can trace their lineage back 1,000 years at least. Most of us are doing well to go back maybe 200 years. So the story begins with this guy, Brian Boru. His significance is that when he came on the scene, Ireland was a place fractured up into little tribes. There was actually 150 kings in Ireland, some of them ruling over, you know, a tiny, tiny area. It was Brian Boru who more or less set about unifying and making the concept of High King a meaningful thing. His army, the Dalcassians, were notable not just because they were good warriors on land, but also by boat. They would often be able to attack other tribes by going upriver or going up the coast and kind of making a pincer movement from both sides. So that's how he, bit by bit, unified Ireland. And it took about 20 years, but more or less he was in charge of the whole place. And when that was done, he set his sights on the next task, which was to rid us of the influence of these guys, the Vikings. And that then finally culminated in the Battle of Clontarf, 1014, in which more or less the power of the Vikings was broken and Ireland was free and you know, run by Irish people. But of course it couldn't last. He died himself at that battle, and within a few generations it had come to an end. But nonetheless, he was kind of a symbol for years afterwards as the concept of a unified island run by Irish people. The sons of Brian Boru, of which there were many, initially were of course called O'Brien, and that's where the name comes from. And to get to the O'Briens that we're going to talk about, the ones in Dromoland, you actually go down through 23 generations of them. And it's all listed in the genealogy, and they all have very Irish names like Donna and Turlock and Tig and whatnot. And meanwhile, of course, while all this was going on, we were invaded again, this time by the Normans. And over time, the Normans kind of morphed into being the English. Now, for the most part, they left us alone. And in time, in fact, there was, you know, the Normans became pretty much Irish people. But then these two guys became in charge of England and decided to put manners on us. Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. It was under them that the concept of England ruling Ireland really, became a more serious proposition. This is Henry Sidney around 1580, leaving Dublin to more or less conquer Ireland properly. This is a soldier of that era. They liked nothing better than to behead Irish people and put their heads on spears as an intimidation tactic, which worked quite well. Sadly, this is the sad sight a few years later of all the Irish chieftains lining up to submit to the English crown when they've been beaten in battle. But they were not left empty-handed. More or less, the way it worked was that if you saw sense and gave in, you could still be in charge of your area, but you were no longer, let's say, the chieftain of Thomond, as the O'Briens were. You are now an earl, perhaps, and you got a fancy coat of arms. This is the O'Brien coat of arms, which you'll notice is not unlike the English royal family, like 3 lions on a shirt, except it's 3 lions that are half gold, half silver to distinguish it. And it was because the O'Briens were considered like Irish royalty. And at that point, now that we was officially that we were part of the ruling authority of England, that the eldest brother of the O'Briens became Earl of Thomond, the second brother, Baron Inchiquin, and then the third brother were simply the O'Briens of Lemina. They had no title. They were the ones who would later become the Dromoland kingpins. And to begin with, they had no special status, but they would in fact outlast all of the rest of them. So if we take up the story now at around 1641, we have this guy, Conor O'Brien, and this is his house, which would be familiar to many people. There's nothing quite like this. Obviously, Clare is filled with castles, but nothing exactly like this. This is in Lemina, on the road outside Corofin, near Kilnaboy. A very striking castle, and that was the one where Conor lived. Conor was, like all the O'Briens, although he was theoretically kind of following the Crown's rules, he would rebel, and he was part of the wars in which the Irish during that decade rebelled against English rule. He got killed, specifically fighting against Cromwell's troops. Cromwell, after the English Civil War was over, came over here to reconquer Ireland and put manners on us. This is him, a fellow who's very famous in both English and Irish history, but for very different reasons. At which point this woman plays a huge part, known as Moira Rua. She was the wife of Conor O'Brien, and upon Conor's death, she was the one really that the fate of everything rested. She was a legendary figure in one way, in that it was considered that during her lifetime, she was meant to be very beautiful, I should say. I'm not sure if the portrait really brings that out, but she was also said to have had many husbands and lovers, many of which she killed when they outlived their usefulness. Well, whatever about those legends, the fact is that when her husband Conor was killed by Cromwell, in the resettlement which should take place after that, what generally happened was that if you were a Catholic or if you had opposed Cromwell, you lost all of your land. So the O'Briens weren't in a good position, but she took 2 cold decisions. She sent her eldest son to England, a 10-year-old boy, to be educated as a Protestant, and she herself married one of Cromwell's officers. So in that way, she held on to the land, and she held it over that decade while her son was away in England. And when he came home, now more or less a Protestant, or enough of one anyway, her English husband had a terrible accident where he fell from a 5th-story window to his death. Whether she pushed him has never been conclusively proven, but it's safe to say he had outlived his usefulness. And which now brings us to the O'Briens of Dromoland. So the first guy you'll note at the top, Donna/Donna, that's because he was born Donna, but he anglicized his name. And after that, you'll notice a pattern that it's kind of bewildering, but at the same time, it's like Lucius, Edward, Lucius, Edward, Lucius, Edward, Donna, and Lucius, Donna. So it's pleasingly symmetrical in some ways. And these are the O'Briens of Dromoland. So let's see this first guy. He lived in a version of Dromoland that was much like this, a standard tower house that you would find all over Clare. This is actually the one in Rallahine, because of course the one in Dromoland no longer exists, but that's the kind of castle at Dromoland in which Donna lived. And now he'd been given a great head start in life by his mother and her actions, but he himself did some useful things. This is a very early map of Clare. Quite disturbingly, you'll note that it's at 90 degrees, but one or two things you'll notice is there's no sign of Newmarket and Fergus on it, and indeed there's no sign of Corofin. Those are two towns that owe their existence to this Donna O'Brien. He more or less made them from scratch. The other thing about him is that he was a wealthy man, and at this stage the English monarch is James, and James is short of money, and he lets it be known that if lads will cough up enough money, you can be made into a baronet, which is, it's not quite nobility, but it's pretty close. You still get to be called sir, and it's you know, it passes on to your heirs. So Donna bought that baronetcy with money, and it was proved useful in the long run, obviously. Now, as for James, he went on to fight with his parliament in England, and ultimately they couldn't have him because he was a Catholic, and England was now, well, rapidly Protestant at this particular stage. So it culminated in the Battle of the Boyne here. At that point, most Irish people sided with James. It was felt that he'd be more sympathetic to the Irish cause. And indeed, it wasn't as if Donna actually had. He had soldiers at his disposal. He was the High Sheriff of Clare at the time. So there would be a reasonable expectation, actually, that Donna would have been there at the Battle of the Boyne. But instead, he more or less said to James, "I'm so sorry, I can't be with you at your time of crisis." And he claimed the reason he couldn't attend was because there was a lot of sheep stealing going on in Clare at the time, and he needed to stay at home and make sure that it wouldn't be happening. So he essentially patrolled Clare, keeping it safe from sheep stealers while all that was playing out. And it left him in an excellent position because, of course, when James lost, there was another round of punishment for those who had picked the wrong side. And it meant a lot of land was confiscated from people, and you could get it more or less for free or very cheaply. And our man, Donna, just hoovered up another few thousand acres. So at around that stage, the O'Brien estate is around 20,000 acres. That's more or less what they had throughout the centuries to come. And at least initially, it would be a very valuable source of income. Donna actually has a very fine statue made to him inside Kilnasula Church, which is just on the outskirts of Newmarket village. It's a very fine sculpture. It's 300 years old, but to be honest, not too many people pass any remarks on it. It's quite fine, though, as you can see. It wasn't all plain sailing for Donna. He had a kind of useless son, the kind of son that rich people sometimes have. His name was Lucius, and he was lazy. He more or less just hung around. He shot his best friend by accident, and he did have a dream, however. His dream was to be the governor of Barbados. He had no basis for that. I mean, he'd never been to Barbados, and in any case, Barbados was a little bit nasty at the time. It was where they more or less pioneered the use of slave labor to cut sugarcane. But anyway, it never happened, thankfully. He never did get to be the governor of Barbados. Instead, he just died in Paris, and he actually predeceased his father, so therefore he never got to be the next baronet. And so it passed on another generation to Edward, the second baronet. So this guy's era is the 1740s and 50s is his high point. Edward is a fascinating character. You could say he was an alcoholic and a hypochondriac. He was certainly a gambler, but nevertheless, the man had a bit of style, you have to say. He was very much into horses. He really pushed Ireland and this area on the map with that regards. Here's an early picture of his stuff. He also knocked the previous Dromoland and built a second Dromoland castle. This one looks quite fine. It's hard to know why it needs to be replaced, but it was for around 100 years. This was the second Dromoland castle. He also built a lot of very nice things around Dromoland estate, such as this, the Temple of Mercury. This is the grotto, it's called. There's an octagonal pond. And he built a fine obelisk to celebrate one of his horse racing victories. Sadly, that no longer is with us. It was destroyed. This is a picture of racing in the Curragh from that era, around the 1730s. It looks fairly chaotic because at that time, the spectators all were on horseback as well as the horses, the riders, I mean. Here's just the scene of one of Edward's great gambles. He claimed that he would be able to get from here. This is a coffee shop, a coffee house in London, and that he would get to Newmarket, where the racecourse was, in his coach and horses in 12 hours. And he put an equivalent of around €100,000 on that gamble. This is his long-suffering wife, Mary Hickman. She was a local girl. She was from Fenlow, one of the outskirts, one of the townlands outside Newmarket. And so to the next generation. Lucius, quite different to his father. He was a swat. He went to Trinity. He was a serious sort of fellow, and he really found his niche in this, the parliament that we had at that time. This, many people recognise this, now the Bank of Ireland building in Dublin. During that century, it was, of course, our parliament. And Lucius was very much a dominant figure for a few decades. He was the workhorse of that parliament, the fellow who actually went into committees, having his sums done and done his proper research. So he was quite influential. For instance, he took the attitude that he preferred breweries to distilleries. And in this, he came across a young brewer of the time by the name of Arthur Guinness. This is his little setup at the time. But Lucius made it so that breweries, as I say, prospered more than distilleries, because he felt that it was better for the working classes to drink beer. He was also hugely influential in getting the Grand Canal built. The Grand Canal had already begun, and they'd set off from Dublin to get it over here to the Shannon. But around here, they came across the Bog of Allen, which is quite a technical feat to get a canal across a bog. But Lucius was the man who got the people to commission surveys and found the money to actually make it happen. And also, this Lucius was quite nationalistic in his way. He set a tone in his speeches for freedom from interference from England. And it kind of culminated in this period, the 1780s, called Grattan's Parliament. Here's Henry Grattan here in the red jersey on the right. And here's Lucius in this brown outfit over here on the left. So he had quite an influence during that time. And he too had a long-suffering wife, and this is Nancy. She was from Galway, and she had 17 children. 14 of them she gave birth to, and 3 more she adopted. Which brings us to the next guy, Edward. His era is from around 1800 to 1830. He's the guy who builds the castle that we know and love today. This is actually a kind of artist's impression before it was built, but it pretty much matches up with the reality of how it was done. It was done, incidentally, by the Payne brothers, who built a heck of a lot of stuff throughout Munster: churches, bridges, Limerick Jail, loads of stuff. Edward's wife was quite a striking woman. Her name was Charlotte Smith from Limerick. And one of her things is she set up an embroidery school. Embroidery and sewing in general was one of the first ways that working class Irish women could have any employment, that wasn't domestic or agricultural. And it was a highly useful skill, which many of them were able to emigrate, or, they made money while they were here, but it was a useful skill wherever they went in life, and she taught them. Here's examples of the kind of work called white work that they did. And it kind of went on for several generations, that tradition within the O'Briens, culminating in this woman here, Florence Viii O'Brien, originally from Limerick. She married into the family, but she did fantastic stuff with both Limerick lace and Clare embroidery later on. So another thing about Edward we can say is that up until his time, the O'Briens owned democracy in Clare. There was 2 MPs for Clare and there was 1 for Ennis. And more or less the O'Briens could at will decide who would get them. The situation in Ennis was particularly ridiculous. There was a period when the electorate, the actual electorate in Ennis was 9 people. So in fairness, the O'Briens could make things happen. That came to an end when this fella appeared on the scene, Daniel O'Connell. Up to then, Edward had been very much in favour of Catholic emancipation, but preferably somewhere else, not in Clare. So it was a rude awakening when Daniel came to town. And indeed, there was 2 different duels fought between the O'Briens and O'Connell men over the whole thing. He was very upset, but ultimately O'Connell broke the power of the O'Briens, and they were never again really able to win much in the way of elections around Clare. And I suppose this is a period where maybe the cracks are beginning to show as well in the good old days of how things have been. These are the Terry Alts, who were, I suppose, a rural terrorist group that came to the fore in the early 1830s. And they did commit some violent acts, but mostly they're famous for digging up fields. They were a protest against the move away from crops towards cattle, and which had the result of rising the price of potatoes. So they dug up fields as a non-violent protest. And now the next guy, Lucius V. Here we are, him. He's a bookworm. He has 2 wives. This is the second one, Louisa. She more or less obliterates the existence of the first one. There's no pictures of this girl, no letters, nothing. And it is suspected that this one's intense jealousy is what led to that. Her name was Mary Fitzgerald. She was from around Ennis as well. Because Lucius is a bookworm, he really does great study on the family. And because the baronetcy line has died out, he manages to get the Dromoland O'Briens to be upgraded from baronet to baronetcy. It's during his era also that the Mahon gold find took place. People will be familiar with the way in which, when the train track was running through the area, they came across this incredible hoard from the Bronze Age. And sadly, of course, a awful lot of it was lost and melted down. In fact, by far the majority of it. But the O'Briens actually got 4 of the bracelets. They bought them, and he gave them to his wife and 3 of his daughters. And those have been passed down through the generations since, through the O'Briens. And it is known that one of them is now underground. One of the women eventually was buried with her one, but the other 3 are still out there somewhere with some O'Brien wearing them. One of the people from the family at this stage is Harriet Mansell. Harriet, there is a very religious family, and she winds up basically being a nun and setting up the first Anglican new order of nuns for several centuries. And this is their first place in Clare, just outside London. Of course, he also lives through the era of the famine. This is the Phytophthora infestans fungal spore, which infects potatoes. How did the O'Briens do during that era? Pretty well. I mean, obviously they weren't complete saints, but they did set up we'll say a situation was that he employed far more people in Dromoland than he really needed, like at least 200 instead of 100. A lot of them just on the payroll to get money. He also was reasonably forgiving of rent arrears, and crucially, on the avenues into Dromoland, the O'Briens set it up so that you could have a soup kitchen on a daily basis, soup and porridge. Particularly the O'Brien women did that. So it would be remembered afterwards that they were decent landlords. And none more so than this guy. William Smith O'Brien was, I suppose, the black sheep of the family to some extent. I mean, he really took it to the next level. He was an MP from an early age. He transferred to Limerick because that's where his wife took him, and he had land out there. But he was initially a fairly hardworking MP. You know, he tried for, I suppose, at least 2 decades to bring to English attention the causes of discontent in Ireland. He did huge research and was a respected member. You know, he was an independent. He was at neither side. For many years, he was at arm's length with O'Connell, Daniel O'Connell, because of the earlier situation with his father. But over time, they began to work together. This is them at one of these amazing repeal meetings of around 1843 or so. There's Daniel O'Connell and there's William Smith here beside him. And then, though, it comes to this crucial year. Daniel O'Connell had done so much, but ultimately he died in Genoa. And now William Smith, I suppose, was the most famous nationalist in Ireland at that point. In this year, he had become, we'll say, a little bit more radical over the years as he despaired that the English would ever really listen. And of course, as the famine raged, he brought it to their attention. Frankly, they weren't, as pushed as they needed to be. He led a delegation over to Paris because the French had actually kind of thrown off their yoke a little bit, and he went over. And what was interesting on that occasion was that the Irish delegation were handed this flag here. It had been mentioned as a concept, but no one had ever actually put one together. Up to that point, the flag of Irish nationalism was classically this harp on green, and but some French women actually gave their delegation these. And so when he came home, there was a warrant out for his arrest, and ultimately the chain of events led to the Young Ireland Rebellion, of which William was the reluctant leader. He felt something had to be done, but really it was a very poorly organised affair, and it amounted to a few days of tramping around in Tipperary in a revolution that just didn't catch fire anywhere else. And this is a shootout at Widow McCormack's house. In the aftermath, here's William Smith. He was caught at Thurles railway station, and during his trial, it would emerge that I suppose if there was 2 reasons why it had really failed. One was the Catholic Church were vehemently against it, and they made a lot of people stay at home. But secondly, it was probably the most infiltrated with informers organization there ever was. This is one of them. I think his name is James Dobbin. He testified obviously against William at his court case. And now we have this classic picture. Well, it's a touched up version of it here, but it certainly must be one of the oldest photographs taken in Ireland in 1848 at Kilmainham Jail. It's certainly the oldest group shot in a prison, we can safely say, possibly ever taken. I'm always amused slightly by the fact that whereas the soldier, the jailer, and Thomas Maher have to stand, because William Smith is a gentleman, he gets to sit. But anyway, that was the situation. They were sentenced to death, but thankfully it was commuted to transportation for life to Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania. So here we are, obviously it's below Australia, Tasmania, and then they were separated, the Young Ireland lads, and William was put in the most remote island of all, one off of the island entirely. Here's Antarctica down at the bottom. After 7 years down there, which was very lonely and was tough, he eventually was allowed to return. He's the only Newmarket man, indeed, who has a statue to him in O'Connell Street in Dublin. But in fairness, it's somewhat ignored, except by seagulls. I think, as Irish nationalists go, he's kind of forgotten. It probably would have been helpful if he had gotten killed in the rebellion. There'd probably be more thought of him. But really, he was an amazing guy for the efforts that he put in, both as an MP for 20 years and then in that attempt at the Rising. The O'Brien thing, of course, the entire machinery operates on servants and people doing the work behind the scenes. Here's a skivvy, as it's known, a woman whose job is to clean and to be a servant to the other servants. It's the lowest grade of servant. These are the upper servants in Dromoland around 1872. Increasingly in Dromoland, they tended to employ their house staff from England and Scotland. Their staff downstairs and out in the fields were Irish, but not so the ones who were closer to them. The farm at Dromoland, whereas they owned around 20,000 acres, they tended to keep around 1,000 for their own farm. They had an extensive dairy, and that would obviously just feed the family and indeed their retinue and produce a small profit, but most of their profits were from rent. The Dromoland estate still has a few examples here and there of the houses of workmen that were there. This one is actually, if you ever play golf there, it's just off the 15th fairway. And this one is buried inside one of the many woods, a very ancient one indeed. And there's some nice lodges. This one is quite visible on the road in Newmarket. It used to be the gamekeeper's lodge. Which brings us to this next guy, Edward Donna. He had 2 wives. This was his first one. I suppose it can be said about him that his mother-in-law, not mother-in-law, but stepmother hated him. So he spent many years kind of in the wilderness over in England, where he was cut out of the family. And most of his marriage to this girl happened during that time. It was the decades when Irish nationalism really began to take hold, the 1880s. This guy here, Parnell, with Home Rule, and Michael Davitt bringing around massive, massive changes in land law, in the land war. On the matter of Home Rule, the O'Briens, of course, were opposed to it now at this stage, whereas previous generations had been nationalist. This lad was intensely unionist. Here he is on the night in 1893 when the Home Rule Bill, the second time around, had indeed passed the House of Commons, but it was stopped in its tracks here in the House of Lords. No, it wasn't just down to him, but anyway, there he was present, and they very much voted down the Home Rule Bill. On the other hand, less successful were the O'Briens at stopping progress in terms to the land situation. Here's a cheeky letter that the tenants wrote to him in 1881, essentially seeking a major reduction in their rents. He said no, but bit by bit, laws were changed, which began to chip away at the O'Brien estate. His second wife was this woman, Ellen, and a new and more modern woman entirely. She actually did quite a bit of journalism for women's magazines, such as The Gentlewoman and The Lady. She had 10 children, and really you'd have to say that they were quite independent, spirited people. This is a picture of a bunch of them at the Temple of Mercury, as I say, a place that you can easily walk to still, taken in the early 1890s. She had, say, 10 children, and one thing about her is that this was the period when morphine had just been invented, and it was being used extensively for women in childbirth. So there had been no understanding yet that it was a bad idea or in any way addictive. So unfortunately, she did become addicted, and she really struggled with it all her life afterwards. You can kind of see in her eyes that she wasn't entirely healthy. As I said, her children were quite independent. This is Lila. She wound up being an artist, kind of landscape artist out in Italy. This is Desmond, poor Desmond. He was a bit of a rogue. He went to Chapter House, one of the classic English public schools, but he did so much pranks that he ultimately got expelled. And no sooner did he do that than he went and joined the army, and specifically the Air Force. The RAF hadn't even been invented, but anyway, off he went in World War One, and the planes were rickety, to say the least. So I'm afraid he was killed in his first mission to the coast in Belgium. This is Moira. She set up a shop in London, quite shockingly, and sold hats. At that point, it was still just not a thing that upper class people could do, is to work in any way, but she did that. And then, of course, there's Beatrice. Beatrice married this guy here, Guglielmo Marconi, who he shocked the family, mostly because although they could see that he was a successful man and indeed famous because of his invention of the radio, nevertheless, he was a foreigner and as such, highly suspect. But eventually they came around. Now we come to the next guy, Lucius, 7th Baronet. Lucius, he, at this stage, as I say, the O'Briens are still fighting hard against the currents of history. They're unionists. He's the leader of unionism in Clare. But what's fascinating is that the unionism at that stage begins to fall apart, whereas previously unionism meant the entire island of Ireland. After a while, it became apparent that the northern lads were going to look after themselves, and to an extent, they abandoned the southern unionists. And he certainly felt betrayed, as letters like this show. But nevertheless, pragmatic, he understood. During the revolutionary period that was coming, the O'Briens, it's safe to say, spent a lot of nights in the darkness, worried, sick, listening to noises outside. People were patrolling around, and they felt they were in danger of being attacked, or worse still, possibly burnt out. As it happens, nothing happened in Dromoland, more or less. And what it would emerge was, after the war, it would emerge that the local people had protected them, whereas the IRA and Clare did indeed wish to, at the very least, attack Dromoland and see could they get money and guns, or possibly worse. The local unit had said, more or less, no. The O'Briens were decent. They were always decent landlords and employers. So they were left alone for that reason. Not so much other members of the family. This is the brother of Lucius at the time. His name is Edward, and his wife, also called Beatrice. They lived just outside Ennis in Rosslevin House. It exists just behind like the Rosslevin shopping centre. Well, their adventures were many during the War of Independence. They, first of all, were out driving in this area of North Clare. This is from a map that's in the military archives. It's called Sheshimore Cross, and it's on the place where you can either go to Ballyvaughan or Carron. They were driving along, 2 cars off toffs, basically, going on a shooting party. And when they came around the corner, there was rocks on the road, and the IRA lads were all around, ready to ambush them, and said, give us your guns. But they didn't give them their guns instead, because they were all well handy with weapons. A massive firefight developed between the two sides. And apparently Beatrice gave as good as she got and was an extremely dangerous combatant. Ultimately, pretty much everybody was hit, but no one was killed. So that was their adventure at Sheshimore. Later on, they had a situation where their house in Rosslevin, while they were having a tennis party, was attacked. But then, cruelly, although they survived the War of Independence, it was during the Civil War that most of the house burnings took place, and 300 of them, more or less, in total. And on a night in July, they came out and burned down Rosslevin. And it burned all night. You can still see this ruin in behind the Tulla Road. But apparently when the morning came, all of Ennis came out to loot the place, and women came with prams to fill them up with anything they could find, like cutlery. And indeed, there was a vegetable garden. They dug up the vegetable garden and took everything. So that's what could have happened to Dromoland, really. It was just lucky that it's still there. Into this era comes a new wife, Ethel Foster. She's an English girl and she is from money, which is quite convenient because that's something that Dromoland badly needed at that time. Ethel's father had basically run cotton mills all across the north of England. This is a picture of Manchester around that era. And really it was a foul way of making money, to be honest. But nonetheless, she made her money, from her father, and she married in. And there had also been changes to legislation. I think it's called the Married Women Act, but it meant that women could hold on to their own wealth in a way which wasn't previously possible, where they had to give everything over to the husband. So she always maintained quite a lot of independence in what she did in Dromoland. Here we see a famous thing about TB, which of course was haunting Ireland at the time. In fairness to Ethel, she put a lot of money into combating TB in Clare, and she helped to build this, which was our first sanatorium on the shores of Balliala Lake. Another thing about Ethel, because she was so rich, a lot of things are named after her. So this is the Lady Inchiquin violin. It's a Stradivarius, and she had it for many years, and now it exists. It's one of the leading violinists in the world, Franz Zimmermann, who uses it. And this is a rose, which is named after Lady Inchiquin. She really loved the gardens at Dromoland, and although they had existed before, they were hugely revamped under her time, and many parts of it really, it's all down to her. So the last generation of the Dromoland, Donna. He was a nice enough sort of chap. Here he is with his Labrador called Tango. Where did it all go wrong? I used to wonder about that. Why had they disappeared from Dromoland? But the truth is, everything about it was part of a wider issue for the British and Irish aristocracy. It certainly wasn't specific to them. The biggest thing that happened was the invention of this machine here, particularly as it was influenced in America. From the 1870s onwards, the ability of this machine to help you reap corn at around 40 times the speed previously possible by hand, it basically made so much corn available in America, and they had built railways that took the corn to the coast, and they had built ships that could take it to England and Ireland. All that cheap corn destroyed British agriculture, and since the aristocracy relied on British agriculture to keep them in money, that really was, the most fatal blow. Also, the vote. Previously, democracy wasn't really a democracy for most of the time. Like, only a tiny percentage of people were actually able to vote for most of history, maybe 3%. So when they began to widen that reduced the power of the aristocracy dramatically. Death duties was a huge issue, not least the fact now that new kind of people were getting into the House of Commons, they upped the taxes. Up to that, the aristocracy hardly paid any taxes at all. Now they couldn't afford these, and World War I was the last straw. Many of the aristocracy really did take seriously the idea of kind of public service and your national duty. They went out to the trenches and they died there. And not only did they die there, many of their oldest sons, but also their workers, the guys who should have been their footmen and their butler and whatnot, they all died out in France as well. So when they came home, there simply wasn't the staff. So Donna, he, as it happened, also fought World War I. Here's him in the Somme. He married this girl, Anne, and he wound up in a situation where his mother, Ethel, the rich one we just mentioned, she wouldn't actually leave Dromoland. Up to that point, when the Lord would die, the rest of the family had to vacate and the new one would come in. It was just unquestioned. But of course, in the modern era, there was no reason for that. She was the widow of a guy who had just died. So she stayed in Dromoland, and he was forced to go and live in London, although he was now the new Baron Inchiquin. And he actually made his living by selling fur coats on Mayfair. Bizarrely enough, at the same time, he was also being considered as the first president of Ireland. he was one of the candidates that people kind of thought could actually, appeal to a lot of people by being an ancient Irish family, but also a Protestant. When eventually Ethel did die, the family came home, but now it was World War II. And bizarrely enough, they agreed that Dromoland should be the place where the Irish Army in the area would stay. So these lads went around quite a bit, and there's still quite a few huts that were built during that period for ammunition. They're kind of returning to nature now, as you can see. The Irish Army, it was said, really were excellent tenants. They did nothing wrong whatsoever. In many ways, they were actually good for Dromoland because they drank so much milk and they ate so much produce and wood and whatnot, and they paid Dromoland for all the stuff. But also then when they were gone, the family noticed there was this little mark in this is the Temple of Mercury. This is Mercury. And they noticed this little thing in his butt here. That, of course, was one of the soldiers taking rifle practice from a distance and actually hitting him. When the dust had settled, the O'Briens had to revamp the place. It kind of had been decades since anything was done. There was leaks in the roof. They fixed up Dromoland and tried to run it as their own kind of B&B. The family still stayed there, but they invited in paying guests and gave them a taste of the castle experience. But ultimately, it didn't work. They tried that for about a decade or more, but exhausted because their banks also insisted. They realized that they would have to sell. So this is Donna and Anne, the last ones. It must have been pretty bad. I mean, the family had been there for over 250 years, but they finally had to let go. So that was it, full stop on the O'Briens in Dromoland. And it could have gone a lot of ways. Certainly, I mean, it could have been just demolished or anything could have happened there. Instead, they were quite lucky. This fella happened to be around. He was a wealthy Irish American. His grandparents had left during the famine, and he was more or less raised by those grandparents. So they had filled him with stories of Ireland. He had a conviction then when he became rich that he would do something for Ireland. He came over here looking to do that. And one of his main ideas was that he would open a shovel factory. In America, he owned about 20 different businesses of all types, but his biggest was the Ames Shovel Factory, the biggest shovel factory in the world. So that's one of the Ames shovels. There's one of them still exists in Dromoland to this day. Instead, thankfully, he met Brendan O'Regan, who persuaded him that a 5-star hotel was how he could help us. And he brought over these 3 Yanks to help him. This is Bill Troutman. He would be the architect who actually fixed up Dromoland to change it from a dwelling house into a hotel. He's also shown here, he was with Ohio State when they won 3 Rose Bowls. This is Carlton Varney, the interior designer. He went on to great fame, really, to be honest. He's designed for presidents as well. And this is Brooks Wigington, the landscape fellow, who both fixed up many of the kind of views that you find in Dromoland. And he, of course, designed the golf course. Did it like in a ridiculously short time. In 6 months, he had turned it into something, and it has some beautiful views. Of course, it's been a successful hotel. Here's Nelson Mandela when he came here in 2000. Famously, he refused to go in until he would shake hands with all of the staff, which he did before he went in. That's Bernard, at least, with Richard Nixon and with Ted Kennedy. Another famous guest was Johnny Cash. He was on an Irish tour in 1975 when he was there. It's been a great employer in the area. I mean, you know, without Dromoland, I mean, it certainly is the place where an awful lot of young people in the area get their first jobs. And then there's guys like these. I think they've been there for around 40 years apiece, the O'Connor brothers. Most famous guests easily have to be George Harrison and John Lennon. These are their girlfriends, Patty Boyd and Cynthia Lennon. They were there in Easter 1964. They came here for a jaunt. And it was the classic era of, they had just filmed A Hard Day's Night, and they continued on the same larking around, that classic Beatles vibe. Today, the Lord Inchiquin is this guy, Conor O'Brien. And today, the last person who lives there as a family home is this Grania O'Brien Weir. She's still alive. She's, I think, 93, and she lives over in Whitegate. And to be honest, she's been a massive help to me in putting together all of this information. And she's a great supporter, really. And this is her book, which she produced around 30 years ago. A fantastic book, really. It remains the definitive account of the family, far more detailed than anything I've said now. So that's more or less it. This is the book that I've done about it. It's pretty much like what you just got there, except a bit more of it. It has around 300 pictures in it. It's available from this website. It's also available in Ennis bookshop and here, this shop in Ireland.ie. If you want to hear more of my ramblings, I suggest you go on Facebook and follow this page here, Long Ago in Newmarket and Fergus. Yes, I do have another book coming up. This is it. It's I have the cover before I have the content, but we shall see. That's coming soon. It's boys and girls from Ballycar National School in 1950. And I suppose the significance, as well as the fact that they're great children, is that the guy in the middle is Michael D. Higgins, now our president. And now I'll finish just with this, my favorite photo that I kind of uncovered during the process. 5 of the O'Brien women, and you can just see absolutely gasping for a fag, as you rarely see women of that era. And it's around 1895. I just love this one. So that's it, really.
That's great. I love that photograph too. I think that photograph is just a story in and of itself, the 5 women smoking there. I think it's great. That's fantastic. Now I have some questions here. Let me just go through them quickly. Now, where was the obelisk located and how or why was it destroyed?
It was not far from where the turret is, you know, the turret that still exists, that's out on the road and is visible from the motorway. And why? Almost certainly because the guy who came after him, that the fellow who built it was Edward. The guy who came after him was a son who, to some extent, despised his father's achievements and his reckless spending with money. And it affected the son's life. The son, to some extent, had to pay back those debts during his life. So I would think that, and he was a practical guy, I would honestly imagine that that obelisk wound up just being recycled into something as plain as a wall or a road. And that's it. It's down to the son just having some level of spite or indifference to his father's achievements.
Okay, wow. All right. We have a comment here from Liam. Beatrice was immortalized recently by artist Marie Canal in a Clare Woman in the Revolution series of paintings. Just Beatrice, I'm not sure which Beatrice that was.
Is she the one in the Sheshimore Cross ambush then, perhaps? You know, that would make sense.
Is she, Liam? Do you know? I'll just see if I can bring Liam up here, if I can. Is that the case, Liam? Yes, he says. Yes, that is.
Yes, it is. It was a series, just as I say, but it was at the museum. But it was 4 women who had fought, and one who was affected, but was on the other side, if you like. You know, a member of the aristocracy who was affected. As you say, they kind of lost everything after that. So yeah, it was at the museum a few weeks ago. It was launched during Clare History Week.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Colin. While I'm talking away there, thank you.
Great. Okay, that's great. Now we have a question here from one of our committee members. Did the morphine addiction and the use of morphine during pregnancy have any effect on the health of the children?
No, I don't think so, because as
Wow.
well, I think what's noticeable about particularly the women of the O'Briens from then on is they really lived long lives. I mean, just around that period onwards, it's like I said to you that Grania Weir is now 93, but all of the O'Brien women for the past few generations have been kind of living to their 80s and 90s. So So I don't think so. No.
Okay, okay. And as part of that question, is the TV sanitarium then by Ballialia still standing?
No, it in fact only lasted a few years. It was burnt
Okay.
down by accident.
Oh, okay, okay. Right, all right. Now, somebody makes the comment, I believe that William Smith O'Brien's brother or son was the magistrate in West Limerick and involved in the jailing the Fenian rebels who attacked Arda barracks during the Fenian Rising.
Quite possibly. I certainly know that that his son was extremely bitter about William's nationalism. I mean,
Okay.
the whole kind of atmosphere changed. I suppose you could say that in William's time, a fellow like him would still have been confident that when there would be a sort of united and separate Ireland, that Protestant people would still probably be in charge, because naturally they always had been. Whereas increasingly as the 19th century went on, it became obvious that they were becoming more uppity, and that even, you know, that nationalism within Protestantism died the death, the more it became obvious that they were going to be, you know, outnumbered by this, you know, and so, you know, like that.
Okay. A few very nice comments. Well done. And somebody asked, where does the last Mr. O'Brien live now, and does he have sons?
He lives in a thing actually was called Thomond House. When they sold out to the American financier, they actually built a house very close to Dromoland. I mean, if you ever kind of park up around the back of Dromoland, it's possible to see it perched up on a hill. It's called Thomond House. So for a few generations, they have lived there, and Conor lives there. No, he does not have sons. In fact, he had 2 daughters. But I believe that nevertheless, a successor has been identified. I don't know how, but it's kind of like back a few steps and then forward a few steps. So there will be another Baron Gwen, I believe, you know.
And somebody asks, is it true that Newmarket on Fergus was named after Newmarket Racecourse in England?
No, it isn't. That was an idea, yeah, that people had, but no. For one thing, it has been conclusively proven that it's in writing before that particular period of the horse racing guy. You know, in other words, the first time that it was written down was in the 1600s, and that predates the guy. So no, it really means that in his world, Clare Castle was the old market. Clare Castle was the established, you know, it's a much older town. So Newmarket was a newer thing than Clare Castle. That's it.
Okay, okay. So I think that's it for the questions anyway. We have a lot of compliments, people thanking you, very interesting talk, and great presentation, great talk there, great presentation, fantastic talk, and very interesting, which it certainly is. It's certainly a very, very interesting family. And thanks for bringing us from generation to generation. There's so much to them, and the way that they, you know, the input that they had in history throughout the number of years, through hundreds of years, really. So if there's no more questions, we'll finish for the evening. I wanted to thank you very much, Colm, for very, very interesting talk, and to thank all of our Zoom listeners there this evening. And thank you for supporting us now as we continue on Zoom, as we have continued on Zoom for this 2021, and looking like it will be the case for at least the beginning of 2022. And I'd like to wish everybody on behalf of Clare Roots a very happy and safe Christmas and safe 2022. Our next meeting will be on the 20th of January, which is the 3rd Thursday in January. It's a Zoom meeting again, and Thursday night, the 3rd Thursday of the month, and we are going to confirm that speaker, but you can keep in contact with us either through Facebook, the Clare Root Society Facebook page, or through the Clare Root Society Twitter feed, or through the website, where we do update information regularly. And the talk will be available to view in a couple of weeks, hopefully before Christmas there. anyway, thank you again very much for your support. And like that, I hope everybody has a very safe and happy holiday and Christmas. And once again, thanks very much, Colin. So we'll finish the meeting for tonight and for this year, and we'll see you all hopefully on the 20th of January in 2022. Okay, thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Happy Christmas, everyone.
Happy Christmas.